conversations. And as you see, this is being recorded, and you're going to be able to get it early in the week, Monday or Tuesday. It will be on our YouTube channel or on our webpage of the Jewish Historical Society of South Carolina. My name is Lily Filler, and I'm president of the Jewish Historical Society. And if you're not a member of our society, please consider joining us and enjoying all of our programming as well as our publications. Membership information can be found on our website, Jewish Historical Society, South Carolina website. It's jhssc.org. The session of South Carolina Jews and the Law that were hosted in June and July was a huge success. And I think you're going to find today South Carolina Jews and Medicine to be equally as fascinating. This is the first of two sessions dealing with medicine, and specifically for this one, the quotas that were applied to medical and dental schools. Our knowledgeable guests will explain why and how this occurred. Before the Honorable Richard Gergel and Attorney Robert Rosen introduces tonight's guests, I would like to remind everyone about our recent pivot from the combined October 22nd meeting with the Southern Jewish Historical Society to virtual. We are now going fully virtual on that. There will be announcements as well as registration that will be going out. Please come to our website to get the most updated information on how to join the virtual program. And as you all know, man plans and God laughs, and that's what we're doing now, trying to get it all together. Please make sure you're unmuted. Questions are welcome, but please send them to me, Lily Filler, in the chat, and I will combine them or filter them and ask our guests at the end of the program if there are any questions. I thank you all so much for attending, and I'm now going to turn this over to the Honorable Richard Gergel.
Well, thank you, Lily, and it is great to be joining my good friend Robert Rosen in our monthly webcast on the South Carolina Jews and Medicine. Joining us as a partner in crime on these two sessions on South Carolina Jews and Medicine is my friend Alan Nussbaum, a practicing physician here in Charleston. Alan finished Harvard Medical School in the first generation post the quotas. And like Robert and me in the legal world, we tended to avoid a lot of the discrimination that our predecessors experienced in the law. Our guests today have done some of the most important work, pioneering work really, on the quotas involving admission to U.S. medical schools and dental schools. This began in the 1920s. Medicine into the early 40s in dental schools. Our guest today, first, Dr. Edward Halpern, and I'm not going to give a detailed introduction to our guests because I want to spend more time having them speak than us speak. These are both remarkably accomplished people. Dr. Halpern is a pediatric radiation oncologist, the chancellor and CEO of New York Medical College, and is widely regarded as the premier expert on the barriers of Jewish entry into the medical profession, including quotas to admissions to medical schools and discrimination in the entry to residency programs. His pioneering articles published in major medical journals names, including the Medical College of South Carolina. We'll get to more of that in a bit. Good afternoon, Dr. Halpern.
Good afternoon.
Good to have you here. And also we have Dr. Perry Brickman, a retired oral surgeon in Atlanta, who has done remarkable research and writing on the dental school, on dental discrimination, dental school education, with a particular focus on the sad legacy of the Emory Dental School and its treatment of Jewish students. His research led to the public apology by the president of Emory to these Jewish students who faced such discrimination during the deanship of John Buehler. And as some of you who recognize that name know, Buehler, after being run out of Atlanta by led by a crowd in the Atlanta Jewish community, became the first dental school dean at the Medical College of South Carolina. More on that later. Welcome, Dr. Brickman.
Thank you very much. Real pleasure to be here.
Let me first turn to Dr. Halpern. Dr. Halpern, share with us how these quotas emerged, why they emerged, and how they emerged in the United States.
In order to understand how we ended up with higher education quotas for Jews in the United States, we'll have to review the history of the Russian Empire in about 45 seconds. So let's start with the war between Napoleon and his invasion of Russia in 1812. Tchaikovsky's 1812 overture, da 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 da. Well, the leader of Russia was the Tsar Alexander I. Alexander I made some minor attempts to liberalize Russian oppression of the working people. He dies and is succeeded by Tsar Nicholas I. And Nicholas I spends about 30 years in a retrograde administration, tightening up restrictions. He is succeeded by the Tsar Alexander II, in Russian, Alexander the Liberator, because he abolishes serfdom in the Russian Empire. He starts talking about a constitution for Russia. He talks about an elected representative of the Russian people, the Duma. But there are terrorist groups in Russia who wish to overthrow the Russian government by violent means. And in 1881, because Alexander II has the bad habit of always taking the same route for his appointments, he is attacked by bombs thrown at him in St. Petersburg. 2 bombs are hurled at his horse and buggy, and he is killed. And he is succeeded by his son, Alexander III. Alexander III has been educated by reactionary Russian Orthodox priests, and he decides he knows why his father has been killed. His father has been killed by attempts to liberalize Russia, and it must be the fault of the Jews, even though neither of the assassins are Jewish. He begins to institute a series of restrictive laws directed against the Jews. The most famous are put in place in May 1883 and are called the May Laws. Jews may not own mortgages. Jews are restricted to certain areas to live. Jews are restricted to certain professions. And most important for our conversation this afternoon, the percentage of Jewish students in universities has an upper limit cap, a little looser in the Pale of Settlement, but very restrictive in St. Petersburg and in Moscow. It is called in Latin numerus clausus, the numerical clause. The Russian government also sanctions a series of economic restrictions on the Jewish people and government-sanctioned riots called pogroms. The idea of a quota system for higher education quickly spreads across Europe, fostered by anti-Semitic political parties. For example, in Romania, Romanian medical students start protesting that their Jews in medical school should match the percentage of cadavers submitted by the Jewish community for dissection for anatomy class. Because of Jewish laws concerning anatomic dissection, this is a particularly sinister and cruel way of restricting the number of Jews. Now, this is the era of what is called auto-emancipation. A famous sermon is given by Henrietta Zoll's father, a Baltimore rabbi. The only place for the Jews of Russia are to be the Jews out of Russia, Rabbi Zoll says. And Jews pour out of the Russian Empire. In 1880, the Jewish population of the United States is about 250,000. By 1920, the Jewish population of the United States is 3.3 million, a 13-fold increase.
Dr. Halpern, hold on a second. Rachel, if you would pop up that chart, that's from one of Dr. Halpern's articles on the growth in American Jewish population.
By 1930, the Jewish population of the United States is about 4.3 million. And this population is concentrated in urban settings and in port cities. Now, there are Jews being admitted to American medical schools during this interval. For example, Medical University of South Carolina admits a Jewish woman to medical school in 1900. Hellman Gant, she becomes a physician in Spartanburg. But by the end of World War I in 1918, American higher education is very upset. The percentage of Jewish undergraduates at City College of New York is 90%. The percentage of Jewish students at Harvard College, I went to Yale. I'm told this is the name of a school somewhere in the Boston area. It rises from 7% to 21%. And the leaders of American higher education say something needs to be done about the Jewish problem. They know what to do. The Russians have taught them what to do. Numerus clausus. The president of Harvard, A. Lawrence Lowell, recommends a quota, upper limit quota for Harvard College. The Harvard Board of Trustees rejects President Lowell's recommendation. He does it anyway. President Nicholas Murray Butler of Columbia says, I do not attempt to restrict Jews because they are Jews. I'm only going to restrict low-class men. It just so happens that low-class men are disproportionately Jews. American medical schools quickly follow suit. We develop new concepts that American medicine has never had before. The University of Michigan introduces personal interviews for the purpose of weeding out Jews. American medical schools start introducing questions like, what is your mother's maiden name? Has your family name ever been changed? All for the purpose of identifying Jews. Photographs begin to be requested on applications to identify Blacks and Jews. And of the approximately 80 medical schools in the United States granting the MD degree, about 85% of them introduce a 5 to 15% quota. By 1932, 1933, about 65% of the people applying to medical school in the United States are Jews, with 65% of the applicants being Jews, but a quota of 5 to 15%, we obviously have a strict restriction on the number of Jews. In the slide being shown now, you can see examples of some of the schools that ignored the quota system. On this slide, the Bellevue Hospital School of Medicine, which would be renamed NYU. So a small number of schools ignore the quota, but that is how the quota comes to America, from the precedent of the Russians and from the Jewish immigration to the United States and the fear of American medicine that there are too many.
NYU, there's Jews in New York.
Excuse me, folks who are not muted, please mute. It's interfering with our audio here. Dr. Halpern, what were these quotas acknowledged at the time? And if so, what were the justifications for it?
The quotas were unequivocally demonstrated by multiple statistical studies. They were the subject of a book by Brune and Britt, some of my best friends, published in the 1930s. The health department of the state of New York established the existence of the quota system, as did many other surveys. Among the most striking evidence acknowledging the quota is a Reform rabbi in Baltimore, Rabbi Morris Lazarin, in 1932, writes a letter to every medical school in the United States and every internship and residency program in the United States and says, tell me about your quota system. And in an era before political correctness, almost every school answers him in the bluntest and clearest terms. All of his correspondence is in the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati, and I've read all the letters. To answer the judge's question, Why was there a quota? The leaders of American medicine say there's several reasons for a quota. Number one, Jews are disproportionately neurotic, and they therefore don't make as good doctors. Number two, there are two kinds of Jews in America. There are the good Jews and the bad Jews. The good Jews are Sephardic, or they are high-class German Jews with names like Brandeis or Marshall. But then there are bad Jews, and they are Bolsheviks, and they are Orthodox, and they are from Russia and Poland, and we don't want the bad Jews. Also, Jews have an attitude. They think they're better than their superiors. Another problem with Jews is they're no good with their hands. They're good with book learning, so they might be all right to be Freudian analysts or maybe pediatricians or diagnosticians, but they can't be surgeons. Okay, for example, you're showing here the letter to Rabbi Lazarin dated January 1934 from the Medical College of the state of South Carolina, listing explicitly the number of Jews in the class per year. And South Carolina offers what was a common justification, which is we're supported by the taxpayers, therefore we have to disproportionately admit people from within the state in the ratio of the state population. But of course, that's nonsensical, isn't it? Because they never considered women or blacks as members of the percentage of the state population. So it was only used to justify the number of white WASP males. What I did in my articles is when the deans did not provide the denominators, I went out and recalculated the denominators to come up with the percentages. So you can see what the quota was. They are almost uniformly for most of these schools, but on the order of 10%. But to answer your question, that's why there's problem with Jews, and most of the deans describe it very clearly as what the problems are with Jews.
Well,
There's also, of course, some of the deans say, of course, you can only admit Jews in even numbers. You can't have 3 or 5 in the class. You can only have 2 or 4 or 6, because you can't put Jews with non-Jews in the laboratory for medical education. So they have to always be in even numbers, so there can only be Jews with Jews.
You've published, and we're going to post on our website in the next day or so, several of your articles, one of which actually lists every medical school that you were able to gather data in, which are most of the medical schools. And they show these numbers. And I know that as Dr. Halpern, as part of our preparation for this program, we requested from the Medical University of South Carolina their graduates from 1920 to 1950. Alan, you looked through those and you verified the same data Dr. Halpern had, is that right?
Sorry,
Dr. Nussbaum, yeah.
I actually went through a couple of weeks ago the class rosters from 1920 to 1970, and it's completely, well, it's hard to know who's Jewish and who's not, but I looked at Jewish names and I looked at people whose families I knew in the community and in South Carolina, and the number of Jews never really got much above 8% that I could see. And some of the classes had none, and some of the classes had 1 or 2. And it was, I mean, it's a very small number. The denominator was usually about 40, 20 to or 30 or 40 in the earlier classes in the 20s and 30s, and then it got up into the 50s, 60s by the end of the 40s, and then up to about 100 in the 70s. So it was a small number.
So
the Philadelphia Community Relations Council, in order to deal with the problem that Dr. Nussbaum just talked about, got a group of Jewish physicians in Philadelphia in the 1940s to go back and trace the Jewish medical students who had changed their names for the purpose of trying to subterfuge the quota in order to get more accurate data on the quota. And that's some of the best data, the data from Philadelphia's medical and dental schools. If there could be anything funny about the data you're showing us, it is the story of what is now called Drexel Medical School, but at that time was called Hahnemann Medical School, which has the quota in place very strictly. And then suddenly in 1948-49, the number of Jewish medical students increases 4 to 5-fold in 1 year. And I tried to investigate why that was. If you remember the movie Animal House, there is a scene where they steal the questions for the psychology exam. And then Hoover, the president of the frat house, comes back and says to the Delta guys, "You idiots, I just came back from the Jewish fraternity. You got all the answers wrong. Okay, you want to know the right answers, you ask at the Jewish fraternity." So what that has to do with our story tonight is I found that at Hahnemann Medical School in Philadelphia, they were upset at the failure rate on the national boards. So the admissions committee decided they knew how to solve the failure rate on the boards. Admit Jews. So in the space of 2 years, they increased the percentage of Jewish students from 10% to 50%. The pass rates jump up on the boards, and then they start restricting Jews again once they were out of trouble with the accreditors.
I know that a major center focus of these quotas was in New York, with these incredible graduates of the City College coming out with great resumes and great academic performance, and then applying to the medical schools. What impact do these quotas have on the ability of these immigrant kids to get into medical school?
Oh, well, we know a great deal about New York because the New York City Council conducted public hearings on the quota system after the death of Fiorello LaGuardia. Mayor O'Dwyer, who succeeds LaGuardia, counsels the New York City Council investigating the quota in New York. And so they put the deans of Columbia and Cornell under oath on the stand, where they say sincerely, "Some of my best friends are Jews." But they end up documenting the quota in New York. You see here evidence from the Philadelphia Community Relations Council that shows that if you take the average grade point average, Jews fared reasonably well if they were straight A's. But while they were willing to admit Protestants with a B average, the Jews are now at a disadvantage of 2 to 1. Okay, so the issue of New York is that the largest state with the largest percentage Jewish population is New York. What's the problem for medicine in New York? There are no public medical schools in the state of New York. New York did not have a public university system of any substance until Governor Thomas Dewey decides to create one in 1948. So there are no public medical schools for Jews to go to in New York, so they must seek seats in the private schools or outside the state of New York. So this is an enormous problem for Jewish students in New York. They try to get into medical school throughout the United States, and they also create the unique situation of over 1,000 Jewish students from New York and New Jersey going to medical school in Scotland, Italy, Germany, and Switzerland in the 1930s. They were called the Scotties, and the American cruise lines ran advertisements in the Jewish newspapers. Buy a round trip ticket. We'll take your kid to Europe for the start of medical school in September, and we'll bring them back in May. And this is particularly a powerful presence in Scotland. The quota system for Jews exists in England, but when the British Medical Board goes to Scotland and tells the Scottish board to put a quota system for Jews, we have evidence of the meeting where the Scots tell the Brits to go to hell. And we also have absolutely charming letters from the Rabbanim of Glasgow. They are mortified by the Jewish medical students in Glasgow because they play touch football in public on Shabbos. And it's a shanda for the Goyim. All these New York Jews playing touch football instead of going to shul. So those are some of the stories from New York. Yeah.
And not all the medical schools went along with it. Talk a little bit about the schools that resisted.
There were about 14 medical schools out of the roughly 85 that ignored the quota system. Going north to south and east to west, they were the Middlesex Medical College of Waltham, Massachusetts, New York Medical College, where I am the chancellor and CEO, NYU, University of Maryland, the Essex College of Medicine of Newark, New Jersey, the University of Illinois, the University of California at San Francisco, Boston University, the Cincinnati College of Eclectic Medicine, the Chicago Medical School, the Women's Medical College of Philadelphia. I think I've just listed them all from memory. I may have left some out. Some of these schools don't exist anymore, but some of these schools, because they were a pop-off valve, became predominantly Jewish. In 1933, the 80% of the medical students at the New York Medical College were Jewish. At NYU, about 65%. There was no internet, but the word very quickly got around where could you apply to medical school and where could you get in. And so American Jews seek out seats in the schools where they know they have a fighting chance. Okay, so the obvious question is why? Why did these schools ignore the quota system? And there are a few basic trends. Number one, schools that had a homeopathic heritage, that had been founded by homeopaths. You remember in the 19th century, the intelligentsia of America were very much enamored with homeopathy. Homeopathy didn't work, but at least it didn't hurt anybody. And so schools with a homeopathic heritage, like Boston University and New York Medical College, had leadership that believed in votes for women, freedom for the slaves and the right of the slaves that were emancipated to vote, the rights of workers to form trade unions, and equity for the Jews. Another reason were schools where there was a powerful political Jewish presence. For example, you will remember there is no social hierarchy in San Francisco like there is in Charleston, Baltimore, or New York. San Francisco is a new city after the gold rush. By the 1880s, 10% of the population of San Francisco is Jewish. San Francisco elects a Jewish mayor in the 1890s, Adolf Sutro, and he gives his land on Mount Parnassus for the University of California School of Medicine. And if he says in his will, if they ever move this medical school to Berkeley, my heirs get the land back. So the University of California, San Francisco admits Jews. Then you have some schools with very powerful leaders who just have no use for anti-Semitism. The president of the University of Illinois, the president of Boston University, he calls bigotry pedagogical paleontology. How's that for an expression? He won't stand for it. You have a school like the University of Maryland, which is state supported, but gives very little money from the state. So it has rich Jews in Baltimore giving money for scholarships. They're not going to tick off the donor base. You have a dean at NYU who was raised by Protestant missionaries and is almost completely devoid of anti-Semitism. So that's why we have some of these schools that ignore the quota.
Tell us the story about tell us a story about the University of North Carolina and the conflict with Frank Porter Graham. I know you've written a very important article on that story.
We have two episodes in the history of the United States of deans losing their job over the quota. One is the magnificent work Dr. Brickman did to document what happened at Emory. The only medical school where a dean lost his job was the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. UNC Chapel Hill had a 2-year medical school, and then you had to transfer for your 3rd or 4th year to another medical school. They had admitted 40 students per year. Upper limit was 4 Jews out of a class of 40, only an even number. The dean would never accept an odd number of Jews. In 1933, a man from Durham, North Carolina, who had gone to UNC as an undergraduate, Morris Krasny, applied for UNC's medical school, and he got a rejection letter saying the quota for Jews is filled. If any of the 4 Jews drop out, you can have their seat, but otherwise, no space for you. Mr. Krasny gets a lawyer. His lawyer writes a letter to Frank Porter Graham, the president of the University of North Carolina. Frank Porter Graham later goes on to become a United States senator. Frank Porter Graham says, everything I learned about race relations, I learned in the Sermon on the Mount. Frank Porter Graham says, I've read in the newspaper, there's a new leader in Germany, he's called Hitler. I'm not going to have that in 1933 here at the State University. I ordered Dean Manning to admit Mr. Krasny. Manning says, if you order me to do that, this school will be overrun by Jews. We don't know exactly what is said to whom in the closed meeting, except we know that Dean Manning resigns and Krasny is admitted. He becomes the 5th Jew. 2 years later, he finishes with his degree, and no one will write him a letter of reference to transfer to the 3rd or 4th year of medical school. He goes into the woman's haberdashery business. He's a clothing merchant in Danville, Virginia, where he lives out his life. If this name sounds familiar, this is the same Manning Drive for whom the road is named to the UNC basketball arena. And there are still very prominent Mannings on the Supreme Court of North Carolina. It's a very well-known family. And this story is heavily reported in the Anglo-Jewish press, but not very much in the non-Jewish press, except for some petitions saying, we love Dean Manning and we support Dean Manning and Frank Porter Graham's a jerk. So,
tell us how these quotas came to an end. What led to the demise of the quotas?
in my opinion, the most important issue was the return of 500,000 Jewish veterans at the end of World War II. And if you look at the causes for the end of discrimination against Irish Catholics in higher education, Irish, Italian Catholics, Jews, and Blacks, return of veterans who say, I didn't get myself shot at and I didn't leave my buddies buried in France in the South Pacific to put up with this. So the veterans return, and politicians quickly recognize that veterans vote and they start to respond. And then on the national level, you will remember that Dewey runs against Roosevelt in 1944 and Dewey runs against Truman in 1948, and that Dewey has two advisors on the Jewish question. One of them is a reform rabbi from Cleveland, Abba Hillel Silver, and the other is a history professor named Benzion Netanyahu. And Netanyahu and Silver say the Democrats are soft on Israel, they are soft on the Holocaust. Rabbi Stephen Wise loves Franklin Roosevelt and doesn't know the difference between access and influence. The Republican platform in 1944 says, vote Republican, we will do something to stop the Holocaust. And in 1948, the Republican platform says, Truman did recognize Israel, he dithered, he was slow. Republicans are decisive. We would have recognized Israel quickly, and we will do something about the anti-Semitic quota. During the election run-up, Dewey creates the State University of New York system, says we will have public medical schools in New York, and they will admit Jews, Blacks, and women. And he puts this in his message to the state legislature. Dewey is well known by the New York Jewish community because as district attorney, he hires Jews in the 1930s. Dewey works his way through law school, singing in the choir of a Reform synagogue. So returning veterans, the creation of a state university system in New York, campaign issue of the Republicans, and then finally, public shaming, these hearings in the New York City Council and in Philadelphia, newspaper articles. Okay, remember, what are the big movies in 1948? Crossfire, about the murder of a Jewish man, Gentleman's Agreement with Gregory Peck. Remember the big hit movies in the 1950s, Anti-Mame with Rosalind Russell? The Arians from Darien, Connecticut, right? That's a big joke. Okay, when it's a joke, it means it's a common knowledge. It starts to become socially unacceptable to be too publicly anti-Semitic in some circles. These all contribute to the end of the quota.
So what ends up like at Columbia? I remember one of your articles, you mentioned that after the quotas in Columbia, admissions rises from 15% Jews to 45% within a few years.
Yeah, okay, and I'm going to give you an example of this, which upsets some people. So, okay, disclosure, a trigger warning. The collapse of the Negro Leagues in baseball, when Jackie Robinson and Larry Doby go into the National League and American League, professional Black baseball in the United States collapses within a few years. With the collapse of the Jewish quota, it creates an enormous problem for Jewish hospitals, because Jewish hospitals could always pick the cream of the crop of Jewish medical students, because there was also a quota for residency training. But now you can become an intern or a resident pretty much where you want. You don't have to go to the Jewish Hospital of Cincinnati, the Jewish Hospital of Louisville, Mount Sinai Hospital in Miami Beach. You can try to become a resident at the Peter Ben Brigham Hospital or at the Hospital University of Pennsylvania. So American Jewish hospitals now have a problem where they're going to get the best interns and residents. And that, for example, is why there is a Mount Sinai Hospital School of Medicine, not because it was designed to deal with the quota, it was designed to deal with the end of the quota. They had to figure we're going to have create our own pipeline for good interns and residents, because we can't be assured of getting all the Jewish house staff. Similar to my metaphor about baseball.
About the impact of the Protestant firms not hiring Jews in law firms. And it led to the creation of these extraordinary Jewish dominated firms in New York, Paul Weiss, Kay Schuler, et cetera. So one of the, those are perhaps not as identifiable today as Jewish firms, but that was the origin.
Well, Richard,
Robert,
we got to move on to dentistry. I mean, you know,
yeah, I'm going to dentistry. No, sir, I'm handing it off to you and Dr. Brickman.
Well, I want to welcome Dr. Brickman. He is going to tell us a great deal about dentistry, but there's some definite Charleston and South Carolina angles to this. But the first thing I want to do is promote his book. It's called Extracted. It's very interesting. It's unmasking rampant anti-Semitism in America's higher education. And Dr. Brickman, welcome to the program. Tell us, the quotas we've heard about in medical schools also existed in dentistry, correct?
That's true.
Give us the 2-minute version.
Well, you know, we didn't know that most of us didn't have a clue about quotas. We sort of understood that there were only a certain amount of Jews that were admitted, but we turned around and said, well, so we were the smart ones, and we didn't, look back and look at the numbers. And I think that's pretty much what happened everywhere. You couldn't speak up, and we didn't have the luxury of speaking up at that time, particularly in the South. We were a minority, and we didn't have the luxury, if we found out, to even complain about it, because you just had to be responsible for yourself. You couldn't speak up against the school. And in fact, if you failed, in which case, in my class, when I went to Emory Dental School, there were 4 of us, and we were all kicked out within 2 years, leaving, all 4 of us. And we were so humiliated that we actually turned against each other. We really didn't even reconnect for 50 years. We went home.
Rachel, can you handle that, please?
Even our parents, said to us, it must have been something that you did because you So I think I found out later, it was only later, even after I was fortunate enough to get into dental school at the University of Tennessee, had a total career, I became an oral surgeon, integrated in the community. I never spoke a word. My wife called us, my group, as we turned out to be a fraternity of silence. We didn't speak up even then. And it was only later that we found out. It was just quite by accident that I found out. It wasn't until 2006. That was, I went to school in 1951 to dental school. So it was over 50 years that I attended a meeting, a sort of an exhibit at Emory University. And it was to welcome all the Jews to the campus and show the changing face of Emory. And it showed a whole bunch of good things that Emory people had done. The last part of the exhibit was bias, discrimination. And I was shocked. I just stood there. What am I going to learn from this? I mean, I was one of them, but I didn't know there were others. And it had this book there. It was called Some of My Best Friends by the Anti-Defamation League. I don't know if you can see it, but it was done by the ADL. And it showed these data. I don't know if you can show it up there, but it showed that that during the time that John Buehler was the dean, and even before then, I think it's important that we understand, before Dr. Buehler came in 48, in 1944, the president of Emory University, Goodrich C. White, cut a deal with the Atlanta Southern Dental College. The ADA, the American Dental Association, had started a study of dental schools. And they were going around to all the dental schools to improve, ostensibly to improve the quality of dental schools in the country. And they said they found that there were too many Jews in dentistry. One race is unequally represented, and that would be the Jews. And so they came around to the dental schools. They came around to Atlanta Southern, told them they were going to put them out of business. They were a proprietary school. You had to be associated with a university. They went to Emory. They said, "You're the university." They made the shidduch. It was a fire sale, and they bought the assets of Atlanta Dental. Up until that time, Atlanta Dental, the non-Jews came from as many as 26 states. Over a period of 20 years, and the Jews came from at least oftentimes as many as 13 states up until 1944. After that time, immediately after they consummated that purchase from 44 to 62, the 26 states remained the same for the non-Jews. The Jews were restricted to 3 states. All the way from 13 to 3, they were Georgia, naturally, South Carolina, and Florida. South Carolina and Florida, however, had to give Emory $1,500 a year for each of their students because they didn't have a dental school at that time. And so they gave that to them in addition to their tuition. So that continued for 18 years until the year after John Buehler left. And so I didn't know that. And I didn't know any of this. And I looked at the data that they had there, and I just couldn't believe it. And I saw some names I knew. I saw many. Oh, it didn't have names. It only had data. So I said, I've got to find all these guys. I've got to identify them. It was really difficult.
What is this chart showing us?
Pardon me?
What is this chart showing us?
What
It's
is
on the screen.
It shows that 64.8 or 9% of the Jews, if you had 26 and 34, 65% of the Jews were either flunked out or had to repeat 1 or more years, sometimes 2 and 3, and sometimes even 4 years.
So they let him in and then they booted him out later.
That's right.
And Rachel, show us the next chart. And what is this we're looking at?
Well, John Buehler when Art Levin of the ADL really got on his case, he was creating some real heat, and Bueller got paranoid about the thing, and he said, I'll show them. They want to have a fight. I'll show them a fight. He got his own data up to show how many Jews there were and how many Seventh-day Adventists and how many Roman Catholics and so on. And he decided to amend the application form. In addition to just asking for who your minister was, he asked you your race, and he gave you 3 options: Caucasian, Jew, and other.
This is a real document, right? You didn't make this up.
That ultimately did him in. It was really more. And by the way, he did not have that printed in the on the print. You know, all the printing had to be done on the Emory campus. He took that off campus. One of the students took it to the ADL. The ADL took it to Emory, and one of the deans went over to Bueller and just read him. You know, he just.
But in a few minutes, because I want to make sure that our audience hears about the Charleston story, you found out that you had been kicked out because of Bueller's anti-Semitism, and you had to transfer to another university in Tennessee.
I was very lucky, only because Tennessee had a dental school, and I had applied there at the same time as Emory. They had accepted me. They saw my chalk carving, in other words, my digital dexterity. They had accepted me, and then now I had to go there with my, tail between my, and I had to hope that they would still regard me the same way they did when they accepted me, and not instead of just looking at me as the guy who didn't do well at Emory.
So once you found out later in life about all this, you did an investigation, which ultimately led to Emory apologizing for its policies, correct? Can you tell everyone that story briefly?
I did. It was very difficult to come up with all this data because nobody wanted to talk with me. Honestly, they would walk across the street if they saw me coming. And, and I knew a lot of people in Atlanta. I was pretty well connected. I had been past president of the Federation. The Community Relations Council didn't want to talk to me. Nobody, they just didn't. I found out later that, Emory had sent down to the Jewish Community Relations Council at the time. They said, you're going to forget this. It's over. The dean's gone. You will consider this as understandable face saving. Just shut up. And they shamed him into doing that. And so nothing happened about it. So that's what I was facing. Fortunately, I had a guy named Ronald Goldstein, who was willing to talk to me. And then when I went to a lot of the other guys, they said, Ron Goldstein talk to you, then I will. And it, and extracted in a way means the book. It means I had to extract all this information from everybody. And
you did a documentary, which was shown to the people at Emory. Then you wrote this book, and that caused Emory to then publicly apologize. What, in 2012?
You could not find a parking place on this campus that evening. It had been, the news had been leaked to the New York Times, and a few days before they leaked the news there was going to be an apology, and people came from all over. It was an amazing event. Even then, I didn't know anything else about other places. I just knew that. And when I got invited to go to many, many other communities to speak, then people would come up to the podium afterwards and tell me about their Uncle Jerry or their father or their cousin. And I found out that there was the same problem, almost the same problem, just about everywhere else. I found out at Temple University, they had as many as 72% Jews in their freshman class. I found a letter in the in the archives at Temple University. I got it from Delaware. It was buried in an archive there, and it's a letter from the dean to the president of Temple University showing how it wasn't anti-Semitism. He simply, it wasn't a quota system. He simply quit taking Jews from New York into Temple. And he said, I pride myself on the fact that there were 72% in the freshman class the year I came. 4 years later, there were 28% Jews. So that's how they got around it. It happened.
Well, I want to get to the South Carolina version because I don't want our audience to miss this great story. Rachel, can we have the next slide? So after Bueller, basically Bueller was forced out by the Anti-Defamation League and the Atlanta Jewish community.
It was one man, Art Levin, who was the director.
Yeah. But then, ironically, he ends up being hired by the Medical College of South Carolina when our dental school was created, right? And
It was
you,
a shock to everybody. It really was. But the Jews in Atlanta, they just said it's over. We're rid of him. I will have to say he tried to get into a number of dental schools, and it's another story I could tell just on the places he tried to get in. But lo and behold, it came as a shock that he had gone under the radar. And we know how he did it now. He did it two ways. The chairman of the board of trustees of Emory University, Henry Bowden, wrote a letter to the governor of South Carolina, his buddy,
right, Donald Russell.
Donald Russell, and he slicked it. And then through the Dental Society, which the Dental Society didn't know, but people such as Howard Higgins from Spartanburg and others who were big shots in the Dental Society, they somehow found a way to get the Medical Society to endorse Dr. Bueller. Then what I was already back in practice. I didn't have any clue about this either. I didn't know. I turned my back on it. I didn't know anything about all of this. And then later when I found it, I was amazed about how the South Carolina CRC behaved as contrasted to what we saw in Georgia.
Yeah, I know it was the people in Atlanta wanted to bury it, but the people in Charleston spoke up. Now, who are the two biggest loudmouth dentists in Charleston?
Well, I have a letter here. Bueller got sick and finally he had to retire. But the guy who got him in, a guy named John Douglas, he was a cattle farmer and a dentist up there.
You got to read the letter.
Okay. He says, thanks, John, for your nice letter and your comments and so on. He said, I read with interest all the stuff you sent it. I just want to say how sorry I am that I had to cause you all this thing, and it's probably caused you to have bad health and all. But you know what? I want you to not be perturbed about all the reaction of the Jews in Atlanta. He says, I just want you to know I've been at war with them since Rosen was president of the Coastal Society.
That was Jack Rosen.
That's Jack Rosen. I attended his meeting while president and saw it dominated by Jews, even to the extent of one trying to sell an insurance program right at the state meeting. And my belief has always been that the Jews would work towards self-aggrandizement. They were motivated by an intense desire to hold office. It's been illustrated by Rosen and that other loudmouth Jew, and he was talking about.
That was Leon Feldman.
That's your cousin too.
Yes, both of them are my cousins.
And he says, I just remember one other, by the way, that Jew from Sumter, Weinberg, but that was a long time ago, he said.
So the Community Relations Committee in Charleston, headed up by Bernard Olasov.
Yeah.
And the only reason I knew about this is I kept a clipping because I was so proud of my father. He was the city attorney. He was on that committee along with Bernard Solomon, the Pearlsteins. It was a Nat Schulman. And then apparently they kept Leon Feldman and Jack Rosen in the background.
Yeah, well, they wanted to have all these silver-tongued orators to go. They knew. I came up and I interviewed you and your dad many years ago, and because I was just amazed. How did you do it? I said, however, I see you didn't win. They said, right. We knew when we were beat because it was a done deal. We couldn't do anything, but we served notice. He wasn't going to be able to do in South Carolina what he did in Atlanta. Right. And we watched him, and he knew we were watching him, and he struggled with that, and he never was able to do what he did in Atlanta. I did interview the interim dean after he had to step down, a guy named Herb Butts, and he said, now you're not going to get me to say anything about Johnny Bueller. No, but then he spent 3 hours telling me all about how Bueller, wouldn't do this and he had to do so and so. So I just had to take my hat off to the people in South Carolina. I had never seen anything like that before in my head.
Well, I want to thank you for your book. I really, Rachel, I want to say I've really enjoyed this book. I mean, this story was mainly about Emory, and it's a very long and involved story. But Dr. Brickman basically did all of his research himself. I mean, like a professional historian, interviewed all the people who were at Emory, and because of his work, Emory issued a formal apology. And so I don't know how we ended up with Beulah, but at least that was all done under the radar by Donald Russell and by
Well,
some
he's
members of the
buried,
board.
you still got him in a way. He's buried at the Episcopal Cemetery there, just a few feet away from his hero,
Oh, well,
John's, Calhoun.
can't win them all. All right, well,
Robert, you want to tell the
Richard, you wanna
story
take some
about the,
questions?
yeah, I want to just want him to tell the story about the going into the, Bueller
Oh, I
going into the
totally
antique
forgot
shop.
about that. I can't
Oh.
believe it. So you interviewed Phil Slotin. Tell that story, but we don't have but a few minutes, but it's a
Okay,
great
well,
story.
I knew Andy Slotin. Of course, I was his advisor at Emory when he was an undergraduate. And I called him up in Charleston. He says, you got to talk to my daddy. So he got on there, and his daddy came from a small town in Georgia. And he told me that he had come to Emory on the train. It stops at the Emory station, and all the APIs were there. And they said, are you Lewis Slotin, Philip Slotin?
Phil Slotin.
Yes, I am. He said, well, we already got a place for you tonight to spend at the fraternity house. And he was happy. Anyway, after a year or so, he and a bunch of guys enlisted. They wanted to go fight for their country. And he went over there to the school to be sure that he could get back in when he returned. And a lady over there told him, she swore to him she'd get him back in. He still remembered her name. Turned out she was the meanest lady you ever saw. She was she was Dean Bueller's secretary, but she didn't know he was Jewish at the time. He goes to the army, comes back, he goes there, and he says, my name is, Slotin. She said, her antenna jumped, she says, oh. He said, you promised me a place. She says, you can apply, but it'll take you 3 or 4 years to get in. He says, what about all these other people that are getting in? She says, you'll just have to stand in line. Anyway, he decided he'd go up to the University of Georgia. He went into graphic arts, came up to Charleston and married a girl whose dad had a prominent
Berlands.
So, a nice antique store. He said in 1964, a gentleman came in to his shop there. I don't guess you call it a shop. It's
Well, Berlands, everybody's familiar with that.
okay. So he says, I'm new here and I've got a great position and I want a really nice mahogany desk for my office.
This is the anti-Semitic Dean Bueller walking into Berlands, talking
And
to
he
Phil
said,
Slotin.
I don't want a knockoff. I want the real thing. If you got something for me, he takes him to the showroom. He said, that's what I want. He comes out, he takes his checkbook out, hands it to Philip. Philip looks at it and he says, I don't know if I want to sell you this desk. He says, you're Bueller? He says, yes, I'm the dean. He says, well, my friends told me you're the one who had a quota and you kept me out of school. Is that right? And I said, well, what did he say? He says, well, we weren't the only ones that had quotas. So I says, well, what happened? He says, well, and I've heard 2 versions of this.
Did he sell him the desk or not?
Well, he looked at me. I said, did you sell him the desk? He says, business is business.
All right, there.
So
Thank you
that's-
so much.
Yeah.
That's such a great story. Thank you.
Lily, we got questions?
She's mute.
Lily needs to unmute.
Yeah, I got it. This goes to Dr. Halpern. Did the Civil Rights Act and the movement cause a change in the quota system as well? Was that influential?
It certainly made an enormous difference in the admission of Blacks to medical school. The quota system for Jews at the time of the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and subsequent Voting Rights Acts was already on the wane statistically. The crucial issue related to the Civil Rights Act was that it was followed by Medicare. And the Secretary of Health, Education and Welfare, John Gardner, said that any hospitals which discriminated and claimed they had a right as a private organization to discriminate might be able to do that, but he certainly could not give them any reimbursement for patient care from Medicare money. And Judge Sobolov of the Fourth Circuit of the federal courts were generally sympathetic to this approach, although Judge Hainsworth of South Carolina had a very mixed voting record on the litigation regarding this. But the combination of the Civil Rights Act and Medicare made an enormous difference in the admission of Blacks as patients to formerly segregated hospitals and the admission of Blacks to medical school. But for Jewish students, I would say no, the problem had largely been attended to because of the returning veterans and the other issues that I pointed out.
Good, thank you.
Yeah.
And another question that's come through, and either one, Dr. Brickman or Halpern can address it. Were women included in the quota, or were women handled any differently if they were Jewish or not?
For American medical schools, women were largely invisible. The first women admitted to medical schools in the United States were in the 1840s. There were people in the United States who believed that when the Constitution said "we the people," that it meant all the people, that it didn't mean white men of property. And prominent Quakers largely create the Women's Medical College of Philadelphia. New York Medical College creates a women's medical college, and there are other women's colleges, but the male predominant medical schools have either 0 or 1, 2, or 3 female medical students, and that does not start to change substantially until the 1960s, 70s. There would be a different story to be written about the quota, but the quota for female applicants to male majority medical schools was in most schools 2%, 4%, 5%, a very small number.
Same thing for dentistry.
And the final question is, many state schools have quotas for in-state residents. Is that a reasonable quota to have?
The argument is that medical schools that are supported by the taxpayers have a primary responsibility to educate the children of the taxpayers to create a pipeline of healthcare givers within the state. So is that reasonable? That is the essence of the American system of public higher education, to offer preferential admission to children of the state to serve the economic and educational needs of the state. In my opinion, yes. The United States has a quite distributed system of medical, dental, legal education with a mixture of public schools, private schools, and amongst the private schools, some religious schools under religious auspices. So what we as citizens would hope is that, for example, for the MD programs, of which there's roughly 165 in the United States now, that on net, we get a diverse group of people admitted. But Americans generally will say, well, some medical schools are Roman Catholic, like Georgetown, St. Louis University, Loyola University. Perhaps they give some preference to Catholic applicants. Some medical schools are under Methodist or Presbyterian origin. I happen to be chancellor and CEO of a college under Orthodox Jewish auspices. On net, we hope the system produces a diverse group of practitioners, but individual schools, such as state universities, yes, give preference to in-state residents, and that is viewed as entirely appropriate and part of the American tradition, because taxpayers say, why should I be paying my tax dollars to educate students from another state?
Right.
Lily, let me make a point that I think one of the reason you had so many Jewish students from New York applying outside of New York to these public colleges across the country was the discrimination of the medical schools in New York. And they made it so hard for Jews to get in. They were applying all across the United States, and they were applying in Europe. And I mean, when Dr. Halpern originally told me the story of the Scotties, 1,000 Jewish students are in Scotland, going to many of them, most of them in Scotland, getting apparently excellent medical educations. All these were escape valves. And also, we haven't talked about this, a lot of Jews were directed into other professions, medical related, pharmacy, optometry, psychology
Yeah.
because they could not get into medical school during this era.
Right. Well, I think it's time that we kind of pull this together. I want to thank again Richard and Robert for their great leadership in these programs, and our special guests, Alan Nussbaum, Edward Halpern, and Perry Brickman. It was just absolutely wonderful. Our next program will be session 2 of South Carolina Jews in Medicine, the history of South Carolina's Jewish medical community. It will be on September 26th. Please put that on your calendar. Another fascinating for your story about your physicians in your community. So you've got September 26th, and then in October, we have our joint meeting with the Southern Historical Society, virtual, remember, it's been changed. And we will have a business meeting on that Sunday, October 24th. You'll be electing new officers and there will be business. So please make it a point to attend that. With this, I'm going to tell you to have a very wonderful month ahead. Wear your masks, please get your vaccinations, and please stay safe. See you on September 26th. Goodbye, everybody.